The sterile hum of the hospital air conditioning was a familiar soundtrack to Grace Thompson's life. He moved through it with the practiced ease of a man who commanded spaces, a CEO whose presence alone could shift the energy of a boardroom. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored navy suit, his Italian leather briefcase clutched in one hand, his custom-designed phone vibrating with the incessant demands of his empire in the other, he was a monument to precision. Every minute of his day was meticulously scheduled, every decision calculated, every emotion, it seemed, long ago traded for unyielding execution. He was here at St. Jude's for a strictly business affair, to finalize a multi-million-dollar funding proposal for a state-of-the-art expansion wing. A philanthropic gesture that would further solidify his corporation's public image while offering substantial tax benefits. He stepped out of the elevator on the 4th floor, his mind already rehearsing the opening remarks for the hospital board meeting. He anticipated a seamless transition from the elevator doors to the closed-door meeting room, another conquest in a life defined by them. But the universe, it seemed, had a different agenda for Grace Thompson that day. Just outside what appeared to be an ICU room, a tableau of unexpected vulnerability stopped him dead in his tracks. 3 little girls, no older than 5, stood huddled together, their small figures dwarfed by the wide, impersonal hallway. All 3 were blonde, their hair a tangled halo around tear-streaked faces, and all wore simple, pastel-pink dresses, identical in their innocence. One clutched a worn stuffed rabbit as if it were her only anchor in a storm. Another rubbed her eyes with the back of a tiny hand, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The third, the smallest, stared blankly at the polished linoleum floor, her lower lip trembling. It was an image so utterly out of place in his carefully curated, ordered world that his first, instinctual thought was to avert his gaze, to keep walking, to let someone else handle this messy, emotional anomaly. But then one of them looked up. It was the middle girl, her eyes wide, brown, and impossibly familiar. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, ripped through Grace's chest. The curve of her cheek, the subtle arch of her eyebrows, the exact shade of brown in her eyes, it was like looking into a distorted, miniature mirror of himself, a memory he hadn't known existed, suddenly staring back at him with a raw, innocent distress. He stopped, his polished loafers rooted to the spot, the hum of the hospital fading into a distant drone. He didn't know why, but he knew with a terrifying certainty that he couldn't take another step forward without addressing this. There were no nurses, no parents, no adults in sight. The girls were utterly alone. A strange, unfamiliar twisting sensation began to coil in his gut, a mix of concern and a deeper, almost primal recognition. He cleared his throat gently, the sound rough in the sudden silence that had fallen around him. Slowly, as if approaching a frightened, fragile creature that might bolt at any moment, he crouched down to their level, his expensive suit creasing, his briefcase momentarily forgotten. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Are you girls all right? Did you get separated from someone?" The tallest of the 3, Maddie, shook her head, her blonde pigtails swaying. "Our mommy's in the ICU. They said we can't go see her yet." Her voice was small but surprisingly clear. Grace paused, the word mommy echoing. "Are you waiting for someone? Is someone coming to pick you up?" All 3 shook their heads in unison, a synchronized gesture of despair. "There's no one else," the girl with the stuffed rabbit, Jane, whispered, her voice barely audible. Just mommy." Grace felt his breath hitch, a strange constriction in his throat. He had no idea why he stayed kneeling there, why he suddenly felt an overwhelming need to know more. There was something magnetic in the way they looked at him, something that pulled at parts of him he had ignored, suppressed, for years. He wanted to comfort them, but more than that, he needed to understand why he couldn't look away from those familiar, haunting eyes. Then, the smallest of the 3, Chloe, took a tiny, hesitant step forward and tilted her head, studying him with an unnerving intensity. "Do you work here?" she asked, her voice a soft, curious lilt. "No," he replied, his voice still gentle, "I'm just here." She studied him for another long moment, her brow furrowed in thought, before softly, almost conspiratorially, saying, "You look like someone mommy talked about before." Grace felt the ground shift beneath him, the carefully constructed edifice of his life developing a single, profound crack. Not violently, but quietly, insidiously. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. That was the moment something in his meticulously built world began to break. He hadn't even reached the meeting room yet, and already, his trajectory had irrevocably altered. He remained crouched in front of the 3 girls, feeling like the world around him had slowed to a strange, surreal pace. Their words echoed in his mind, especially Chloe's last one. "You look like someone mommy talked about." It wasn't just the startling resemblance or the way they stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. It was the feeling deep in his chest, the sudden, undeniable certainty that this wasn't a coincidence, that this was something far more profound than a chance encounter. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know where to place the sudden, crushing weight of that realization. So he did the only thing he could. He stayed with them. He gently asked their names, and they introduced themselves in soft, slightly trembling voices: Maddie, Chloe, and Jane. Each name was like a small stone dropped into calm water, rippling through memories he hadn't touched in years. He asked about their mother, and they told him her name was Emma. That name was no stranger. It hit him like a physical blow to the stomach, a punch that stole his breath. Emma. He remembered Emma perfectly. The warmth in her voice, the way she used to laugh at things no one else found funny, the way she had once looked at him like he was the only man in the world. They had shared something real, something brief but undeniably unforgettable. And then she had vanished, a ghost of a memory he had, by his own admission, allowed to fade. They hadn't spoken in 5 years. He had searched once, half-heartedly, in the early days, but work had swallowed him whole, and he had let her memory drift further and further away until now. Until these 3 girls, who looked like they might carry pieces of him in their faces, were standing in a hospital hallway with nowhere to go. Grace slowly stood and glanced around. Still, no staff had come to check on the girls. An unfamiliar frustration, hot and sharp, began to build inside him. How could no one be helping them? This wasn't how things were supposed to work in a place like this, a place of healing and care. He pulled out his phone, his mind racing, and walked to the nurse's station. When he finally got the attention of the woman behind the counter, he kept his voice steady but firm, a tone that usually commanded immediate action in any other setting. There are 3 children alone in the hallway outside ICU room 402, he stated, his gaze unwavering. They've been waiting there for who knows how long. Can someone check on them? The nurse blinked, then looked towards the corridor, a flicker of recognition, then mild annoyance crossing her face. Oh yes, that's Emma Rivers' room. The girls have been waiting most of the day. We've been short-staffed, and since they weren't technically. Grace didn't let her finish. They're 5 and they're terrified. Someone needs to be responsible for them. His voice had taken on an edge he rarely used outside of high-stakes negotiations. She gave him a slightly defensive nod. I'll notify the social worker. But Grace had already turned back. He didn't need someone else to step in. He couldn't explain it, but he felt something profound shift inside him. A sense of urgency mixed with a crushing, undeniable responsibility. It wasn't charity. It wasn't guilt, not entirely. It was something far deeper, a primal pull he hadn't known he possessed. When he returned to the girls, they were sitting on the floor now, holding hands, huddled close, a tiny island of vulnerability in the vast, impersonal hospital. He crouched again, this time more slowly, his movements less stiff, more deliberate. Your mom, he began gently, his voice softer than he'd heard it in years. She and we knew each other a while ago. Chloe, the middle girl, tilted her head, her bright eyes searching his. Are you a friend? I think I used to be, he said quietly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Mommy never talks about friends anymore, Maddie added, her voice a mournful sigh. Only work and bedtime stories. Grace felt something inside him crack again, a deeper fissure in his carefully constructed emotional wall. They talked a little more after that, about their favorite cartoons, their favorite colors, and what they missed about home. None of them cried anymore, but they still clung to one another as if letting go would shatter the fragile safety they'd built in that hallway. When the social worker finally arrived, a kind woman with tired eyes and a clipboard named Marissa, Grace stood to meet her. She asked who he was, and for a brief moment he didn't know what to say. The labels that defined his old life felt utterly irrelevant here. I'm someone who used to matter to their mother, he said, the words surprising him with their raw honesty. And I think I might matter to them too. He stayed while the girls were taken to a small waiting room with toys and juice boxes. He gave his number to the social worker and asked for updates, his hand shaking slightly as he typed. He wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was clear, he wasn't walking away. Not from Emma. Not from these girls. Not from the life that had just reappeared without warning and demanded to be faced. The hours that followed passed in a haze for Grace, but everything inside him remained sharply, painfully alert. He hadn't returned to his meeting. The thought of discussing funding proposals while Emma lay unconscious in intensive care and 3 little girls waited alone in a side room felt almost grotesque, an insult to the sudden, profound shift within him. Instead, he spent that day and the next trying to understand what had happened to the woman he once knew and the life that had unfolded in his absence. He learned from Marissa that Emma had been admitted the previous night following a sudden, severe medical crisis. Details were sparse, guarded by patient confidentiality, but the seriousness was clear. She was unconscious and stable, but in critical condition. No other relatives had been listed, no emergency contacts, just the children. It was that detail, no one else, that haunted him. Grace had spent the past 5 years believing Emma had chosen a life without him, that whatever they'd shared had been fleeting or simply not enough for her. He convinced himself she was fine, living her quiet life, perhaps happily married with a family. But now he was beginning to wonder if her silence had come from something else entirely, fear, protection, or a profound sacrifice. He thought back to how their relationship had ended. It wasn't a fight or a betrayal. It was a slow, agonizing drift caused by the growing gap between her quiet, grounded world and his relentless corporate climb. She had said goodbye in a note, one he had barely had time to read at the time, dismissing it as an overly emotional, impractical gesture. He remembered her writing that she needed something real and steady and that she hoped he would someday find it too. He hadn't. Not until now. That afternoon, he stood in the hallway again, this time outside Emma's room, the steady beep of monitors faintly audible through the door. A kind nurse, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding, allowed him in for a few minutes. Emma looked so small in the hospital bed. Her blonde hair was damp around her temples, her skin pale, her breathing slow and mechanical, aided by a ventilator. He walked in slowly as though entering a sacred space. He sat beside her, unsure if she could hear him, unsure if any of his words would penetrate the veil of her unconsciousness. "I don't know what happened to you," he whispered, his voice raw with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "But I think I finally understand what happened to us." He hesitated, then reached for her hand, gently wrapping his fingers around hers. Her skin was cool, almost fragile beneath his touch. "There are 3 little girls down the hall who look so much like you it hurts. But they look like me too. I don't know why you didn't tell me. I don't even know if you wanted to, but I met them, Emma. Maddie, Chloe, Jane. They're brave, scared, smart. They waited for you all day without complaining. I've never seen anything like it." His throat tightened, the words coming slower, heavier. "Emma, I think they're mine too." He didn't expect a response, but then he saw her fingers twitch slightly beneath his. Maybe it was a reflex. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it was enough to make him stay another hour, just sitting there, telling her about everything she'd missed. How cold the hallway had been. How Chloe had tried to explain her dream to him in full, vivid detail, her small hands illustrating the fantastical creatures. How Maddie had stood in front of her sisters like a little soldier, a tiny protector, even in her own fear. And how Jane had quietly clung to her stuffed bunny the entire time, her silent presence a profound weight. When visiting hours ended, he returned to the waiting room where the girls sat with coloring books and juice boxes, their initial shyness around him having softened into a cautious acceptance. He brought them dinner from the hospital cafeteria, surprisingly palatable chicken nuggets and apple slices, and sat on the floor with them, listening to their stories about their mom. How she always kissed them in the same order before bed. How she sang made-up songs when the lights went out, silly tunes about brave knights and talking animals. How she whispered always, always when they asked if she would ever leave. They talked about their bedtime rituals, their favorite toys, the tiny apartment they lived in, which sounded far less grand than his own sprawling condo. The more he listened, the more he saw the gaps his absence had left, the more he realized how much he had missed. At one point, Maddie looked at him with wide, earnest eyes and asked, "Did you love our mommy?" He paused, caught off guard by the directness, the innocent audacity of the question. Then he nodded slowly, definitively. "Yes, I did. Very much." "Do you still?" she pressed, her voice a soft echo of his own unspoken question. He thought about it. Thought about what love meant now after everything. After the years of ambition, the carefully constructed detachment, the sudden shattering realization of what he had truly lost. "Yes," he said finally, meeting her gaze. "Maybe more than I ever did before." That night, after the girls had finally fallen asleep, curled together on a couch in the family waiting area, Grace sat alone in the corner of the room. He stared at the blank wall for a long time, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Then he took out his phone and called his assistant, a woman who rarely heard anything but firm directives from him. "Cancel everything for the next 2 weeks," he said, his voice devoid of its usual corporate crispness. There was a stunned pause on the other end. "Sir, you have?" "I mean, the board meeting, the quarterly reports, the acquisition deal." "I know," he interrupted, his gaze fixed on the sleeping figures of the 3 girls. "Cancel it anyway." He ended the call and looked back at the girls, curled together like petals of the same flower, their little hands intertwined. He had made his choice. And this time he wasn't going to miss what truly mattered. The next morning, Grace arrived at the hospital before sunrise. The hallways were dim and quiet, filled only with the soft shuffle of nurses changing shifts and the distant, rhythmic hum of machines keeping patients stable. He walked with purpose but without rush, stopping first at the waiting area where the girls had slept the night before. They were still there, tangled together beneath a hospital-issued blanket, their cheeks flushed with sleep, their little arms draped over one another as if they couldn't rest unless they were touching. Grace stood in the doorway and watched them, something deep inside his chest tightening with a kind of protective ache he had never known. He had made decisions his entire life based on logic and returns. But this was different. This was something his heart understood before his mind could even form the words for it. He left a note with a nurse letting them know he would be back soon and then walked down to the ICU. Emma's condition hadn't changed overnight. She remained unconscious, her body still fragile but holding on with a quiet resilience. Grace sat beside her again, this time with more certainty in his movements. He didn't just talk about the girls. He told her about himself, about the life he had built, the emptiness that came with success, and how all of it had started to feel meaningless the moment he saw 3 pairs of eyes staring up at him in that hallway. "I used to think I had time," he said quietly, his voice raspy with emotion. "Time to chase goals, time to come back to things I left behind. But the truth is, I let go of you too easily. And now I realize I might have let go of the only part of my life that had real meaning." He stayed until the nurses reminded him it was time for rounds, then returned to the girls. They had woken by then, brushing sleep from their eyes and accepting juice boxes from a tired but kind volunteer. When they saw Grace walk in, their faces lit up, not with surprise, but with the comfort of someone they now expected to see. It startled him how quickly he had become a constant in their eyes. He sat on the floor with them again, listening as they took turns explaining the names of their stuffed animals and which cartoons they hated. Jane, the quietest of the 3, leaned into him without saying a word, simply resting her head against his arm while she colored. He didn't move. He didn't dare. That afternoon, he met with Marissa, the social worker, again, this time with questions not about visitation or hospital policy, but about guardianship. He didn't know the system, but he wanted to. He wanted to do this right. He wanted to make sure that no matter what happened to Emma, the girls wouldn't end up with strangers, wouldn't be lost in the shuffle of paperwork and state agencies. He gave his name, explained his connection, and then, because he didn't want to delay even a moment longer, requested a DNA test. Marissa, a sharp but compassionate woman, listened closely. She didn't make promises, but she saw the look in his eyes and the way the girls clung to him. She agreed to move the process forward as fast as legally possible. That night, Grace took the girls back to his condo. It was sleek, modern, cold in its perfect lines and polished glass. It had never been a place meant for children. But the moment they walked through the door, holding his hands and carrying their little bags and favorite toys, the space felt different. Their giggles bounced off the walls, their tiny socks slipped across the smooth floors, and Grace found himself laughing more in that one evening than he had in months. He ordered pizza. He let them sit on the couch with greasy hands, crumbs scattering across the pristine white cushions. He read bedtime stories in 3 different voices because they insisted each character needed their own. When they finally fell asleep in the guest room together in one bed, refusing to be separated, he stood in the doorway and watched them for a long time, overwhelmed by how natural it had all begun to feel. He thought of Emma again, thought of her lying in that hospital bed with no idea that the man she once loved had returned and was trying to put the pieces back together. He didn't know if she would ever wake up, but he knew without a shadow of doubt that if she did, she wouldn't find them alone. He would be there and he wasn't leaving. By the end of the week, Grace had begun to fall into a rhythm, one that was unfamiliar and often chaotic, but surprisingly grounding. Mornings started with brushing tangles out of 3 very different heads of blonde hair, pouring uneven bowls of cereal, and learning the nuances of what kind of apple slices each girl preferred in her lunch. The rigid structure of his old life, early calls, boardroom meetings, flights scheduled to the minute, had dissolved into crayons on the kitchen counter and a forgotten laptop gathering dust in the corner. He hadn't planned any of it, and yet he couldn't imagine walking away. He drove the girls to school in a car that once only carried briefcases and silence. Now it echoed with questions, arguments about cartoon characters, and one girl, usually Maddie, insisting on picking the music. After drop-off, Grace found himself circling back to the hospital each morning, visiting Emma's room before any other part of his day. Her condition remained unchanged, a persistent, agonizing limbo, but the nurses had gotten used to his presence, even leaving a second chair by her bedside. He spoke to her every day about the girls, about what they were doing, what they said. How Jane had started whispering a little more. How Chloe had told him he didn't know how to fold clothes the right way but that it was okay because you're trying. He told Emma that he missed her in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the emptiness that had grown inside him over the past 5 years. He admitted how scared he was to be raising children he hadn't known existed and how, despite that fear, he had never felt more certain about anything in his life. Her hand never moved, her eyes never opened, but he stayed anyway. One afternoon, after picking the girls up from school and helping them with their crafts at the dining table, he sat with Marissa, the social worker, to review the results of the DNA test. The proof was printed on a thin white page, stark and undeniable. He was their biological father. Marissa handed it to him with a look that said she expected more of a reaction, perhaps a gasp, a tear, some outward display of profound shock. But Grace only nodded. The test hadn't told him anything his heart hadn't already accepted. He had known it in the way Chloe rolled her eyes, a mirror of his own impatient habit. In how Maddie crossed her arms when she was frustrated, exactly like him. In how Jane stared without blinking when she didn't understand something, a trait he recognized from his own intense focus. They were pieces of him, wild, gentle, stubborn, and brave. Marissa then began walking him through the complex process of becoming their legal guardian, at least temporarily. There would be evaluations, court dates, endless paperwork. It would take time, and until Emma recovered, no decision could be final. But Grace didn't flinch at the steps ahead. He simply asked what he needed to do and began doing it. He even started researching preschools closer to his apartment, places that had music programs and outdoor space, and that didn't feel like holding cells. He asked the girls about what they liked and disliked about their current school, trying to make them feel included in decisions about their new lives, to give them a sense of agency in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. That weekend, he took them shopping for new clothes, not because they didn't have enough, but because he wanted them to have something that wasn't secondhand or worn at the knees. They picked dresses with sparkles and light-up shoes and insisted he get a bright red tie so he could match. He wore it without argument, even to a casual dinner. Later that evening, they all cooked dinner together, which mostly meant he cleaned up flour explosions and tried not to burn the pasta, their small, eager hands making chaos of his minimalist kitchen. When the girls finally went to bed, full of stories and sugar, Grace sat down on the edge of his couch, looking at the empty space around him and realizing it no longer felt empty. It was filled now with tiny drawings taped to the fridge, mismatched socks under the table, and laughter still echoing down the hallway. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant asking if he would be available for a rescheduled board call in the morning. He stared at the screen for a long time before typing back a simple answer, "Not yet." He placed the phone down and walked to the guest room, peeking in to find all 3 girls curled up in the same bed, tangled in each other's limbs, deeply asleep. He watched them for a moment, overwhelmed by a feeling that had no name, only weight. He didn't know what the future would look like, didn't know how long Emma would remain in that hospital bed or what challenges lay ahead. But he knew with complete clarity that his life had been rewritten and he had no desire to go back to the one he had before. On the 12th day of Emma's hospitalization, something changed. It was subtle at first. Her fingers moved, then her eyelids fluttered, and the monitors picked up a slight shift in her vitals. Grace had just arrived, as he did every morning now, bringing coffee to the nurses and sitting by her bedside with quiet patience. He had grown used to the rhythm of the room, the sterile smell, the quiet hum of machines. But today, when her hand twitched beneath his, he nearly dropped the cup he was holding. The nurse rushed in, checked the machines, whispered that it could be a sign of awakening. Grace barely breathed for the next 10 minutes. He leaned forward, spoke her name, watched her eyelids twitch again, and this time, slowly open. Her gaze was unfocused, dazed, her lips dry and slightly parted. She blinked at the harsh light overhead and then slowly shifted her eyes toward him. At first, there was no recognition. Then, as if memory caught up to consciousness, her brow furrowed. Her voice came out cracked and barely audible, but it was enough. "Grace." He nodded, overwhelmed, a lump forming in his throat. "I'm here. I've been here." Her eyes welled up immediately, confusion swimming behind the tears. "The girls, are they?" "They're safe. They're with me," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion. "They've been brave, Emma. They waited for you. Every single day." She cried then, weakly, silently, but completely, tears tracing paths down her pale cheeks. Grace held her hand, letting her process the reality she had woken into. The nurse gave them a few minutes before quietly stepping out, closing the door behind her, leaving them in a fragile bubble of rediscovery. He stayed with Emma as she calmed, as the fog of sedation and fear slowly lifted from her face. I didn't know how to tell you, she said, voice still rough and barely above a whisper. I wanted to so many times, but you were so far away. You were already living a different life. You should have told me, Grace said, but not accusingly. It was filled with regret, not blame. I would have come. I would have been there. I was afraid, she admitted, her gaze meeting his, vulnerable and honest. Afraid you'd feel trapped. Or worse, that you'd feel nothing. Grace sat back, breathing in deeply, letting the weight of everything settle between them. I didn't know. But the moment I saw them, I did. Emma closed her eyes for a moment as if exhausted by the conversation. When she opened them again, she looked straight at him, her gaze unwavering. Are you really here? He didn't hesitate. Yes, and I'm not leaving. He told her about the days she had missed, about the hallway, about how Maddie had stood tall like a little soldier, how Jane barely spoke but clung to her stuffed rabbit, how Chloe had asked hard questions and demanded answers. He told her about the pancakes he'd burned, the songs they sang in the car, the messy bedtime routines that somehow ended with all three of them in one bed, their small bodies tangled together. He saw her smile, tired but real, and for a moment he felt the world tilt back into place, a sense of rightness settling over him. When the doctor came in, they spoke in low tones. Emma's recovery would be slow. Her body was weak and she would need rehabilitation. But the prognosis was good. She would recover. That night, Grace brought the girls to the hospital, not into the room, but just close enough. They stood outside the glass, their faces pressed against the cool pane, and when Emma saw them, her hands trembled with emotion. The girls waved furiously, pressed their hands to the glass, and Emma pressed hers from the other side, a silent, powerful connection. She mouthed the words, I love you. And all three girls did the same back. Maddie held up a drawing they had made that morning, stick figures holding hands beneath a house with the sun in the corner. It said, home, in big, shaky letters. Emma cried again, and so did Grace. When they left the hospital that night, the girls were quiet in the car, holding his hands from the back seat, their small fingers trustingly intertwined with his. He looked at them in the rearview mirror and said, Your mommy's going to be okay. Chloe asked, And us? He smiled softly, a genuine, unburdened smile. You're going to be better than okay. Because now they weren't waiting anymore. They were beginning. And for the first time, it felt like they were all part of the same story. The days that followed Emma's awakening were filled with slow progress, quiet miracles, and the kind of small victories that only mattered to those who had lived through profound uncertainty. Grace balanced hospital visits with school drop-offs, nighttime stories, and learning to braid 3 sets of blonde hair imperfectly but with an effort that the girls never failed to praise. He had always thought multitasking meant juggling high-stakes deals and managing corporate crises. Now he understood that true multitasking was holding a sick child in one arm while flipping pancakes for 2 others who refused to eat them unless they were shaped like stars. Emma's recovery moved steadily. She began speaking with more clarity, sitting up for short stretches, even requesting to read notes the girls had written for her, their misspelled words and earnest drawings bringing tears to her eyes. Grace brought them in for short visits, and every time they entered the room, Emma's energy seemed to return in waves. The girls never overwhelmed her. They were instinctively gentle, each offering affection in their own way. Maddie sat closest and asked about the machines, her curious mind dissecting the medical equipment. Chloe always brought stories to retell, her imagination boundless. Jane simply held her mother's hand, quietly watching her face with those large, thoughtful eyes, a silent anchor. One afternoon, as Emma napped and the girls played with coloring books in the hospital lounge, Grace stood with Marissa by the window. The sun poured through the glass in golden beams, and the world outside moved like it had before, unaware of the tiny shifts that had turned his life inside out. Marissa had paperwork in her hands, documents that would allow Grace to take the next step toward permanent custody, should Emma agree. The forms felt heavy in his hands, not with burden but with the profound realization that he was choosing this not because he had to, not because of obligation or guilt, but because somewhere in the beautiful chaos of the past few weeks, he had truly become a father. Later that evening, Grace sat beside Emma in her hospital room. The lights were low and the girls had gone home with a trusted sitter. Emma's hair was pulled back now, revealing the faint lines of fatigue around her eyes. And though her face still held traces of exhaustion, there was more color in her cheeks, more awareness in her gaze. She looked at him like someone seeing a familiar place through new eyes, a place that had changed but was still home. They love you, she said softly, her voice still a little weak but clear. I love them, he replied just as quietly, his hand resting near hers on the crisp white sheets. And you? Emma didn't look away. You've changed. You're softer but stronger somehow. I didn't know what I was missing, he said, a wry, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. Until I found it all standing outside a hospital room in pink dresses, crying. I wanted to protect them, she admitted, her gaze dropping to their joined hands. From everything. Including you. I understand why, Grace said, his voice gentle. But I'm here now. And I want to do this with you, not around you. They talked for a long time, not about the past or blame, but about logistics, hope, and the uncertain path ahead. Grace told her about the girl's new favorite bedtime song, about how Jane had finally started talking more when she was coloring, about Chloe insisting they all eat the same cereal because that's what families do. He watched Emma take it all in, and he saw something soften further in her, a quiet acceptance. When she asked about the custody papers, he didn't push. He said he would wait, that her healing mattered more, that whatever decision they made, it would be together. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I think we're already a family, she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. We just have to learn how to be one. That night, as Grace tucked the girls into bed, he realized how right she was. It wasn't about claiming a title or defining roles. It was about presence, about consistency, about the 1,000 small choices made each day to love, to show up, and to try. The girls were asleep quickly, their bodies curled in familiar patterns, their trust in him no longer tentative, but full. Grace stood at the doorway and looked at them. 3 lives that had once been hidden from him, now the very center of everything. And in that stillness, he knew the hardest part was no longer the unknown. It was holding on to everything he'd found and never letting go. A month later, the hospital room where Emma had once lain pale and unresponsive stood empty. She had been discharged just 3 days earlier, walking out with slow but steady steps, her daughters clinging to each of her arms like the strongest support she could ever need. Grace had driven them home in his car, which had somehow become a second living room filled with crayons in the glove box and cereal bar wrappers under the seats. They returned not to her old apartment, which had been vacated while she was hospitalized, but to Grace's home, now transformed. What was once sterile and minimalist had evolved into a space filled with warmth. There were toy baskets in the hallway, tiny socks stuck in the couch cushions, drawings taped to kitchen cabinets, and a table set for 5 every night, whether or not everyone was hungry. Emma's first night home, they all sat around the dinner table eating spaghetti that Chloe had insisted be dyed pink. The girls talked over one another, giggling and giving chaotic updates on school, their small voices a symphony of joy. Emma listened, teary-eyed at first, until she too began to laugh. Her laughter was quieter than before, tinged with fatigue, but it was real, a melody Grace hadn't known he desperately missed. Grace watched her from across the table, not with pity or apology, but with a profound admiration. She had survived something that would have broken many people, emerging with a quiet strength that inspired a new kind of reverence in him. And yet here she was, passing the salt, making sure Maddie wiped sauce off her cheek, and reminding Jane not to eat with her fingers. As the days passed, their routine deepened. Grace adjusted his work schedule permanently, transferring leadership of several key projects and even stepping down from his role as CEO, keeping only the chairman's position so he could be home for bedtime stories and school pickups. The business world saw it as a shocking pivot. Headlines described him as walking away at the top, a baffling decision for a man once driven solely by ambition. But Grace didn't care. He hadn't walked away. He had finally walked towards something. Every morning started with breakfast made together, often a chaotic parade of spilled milk and mismatched shoes. Every evening ended with the girls curled up in pajamas, listening to one of Emma's gentle stories or Grace's made-up space adventures featuring characters named after their favorite toys. On a Saturday in early spring, they threw a small party in the backyard to celebrate the girls' 6th birthday. Friends from school came, neighbors brought cupcakes, and someone had even arranged for a magician. But what stole the day wasn't the magic tricks or balloons. It was the moment Emma stood, microphone in hand, her voice trembling slightly, and thanked everyone for being part of what she called the most unexpected, most beautiful second chance life could offer. Then she looked directly at Grace, her eyes soft and steady, brimming with a love that had been rekindled and rebuilt. "And thank you," she said, her voice catching, "for finding us when we didn't even know we were looking to be found." Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the girls were asleep, surrounded by wrapping paper and glittery crowns, Emma and Grace sat outside on the porch beneath a string of twinkling lights. The night air was warm, the kind that settles into your skin like memory. They didn't speak for a while, just listened to the crickets and the faint sound of wind moving through the trees. Finally, Emma turned to him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed in touch? If I had told you back then?" He shook his head, not with regret, but with clarity. "We might have had a version of this sooner, but maybe it wouldn't have been this version. And I like this one. It's messy and hard and completely out of my control, but it's ours. She nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. You're not the man I left. He smiled and took her hand, intertwining their fingers. And you're not the woman who walked away. They stayed that way in silence for a long time, watching the house that now held the four people who had become his entire world. The laughter, the challenges, the noise, the quiet, it was all real, and it was theirs. Inside, taped to the fridge among the drawings and reminders, was a piece of paper written in colored marker by the girls earlier that week. It read in uneven, joyful letters, "Home is everyone being together always." And in that moment, Grace knew they weren't just a family. They were a miracle rebuilt from pieces he never knew he had lost. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure it never fell apart again.